Welcome to Mind Over Matter. Today we're going to talk about homelessness, and my guest is Jean Stanford, who is the Assistant Director of the Cardinal Madero Center in Boston, a day program for older homeless people. And so perhaps we could start with that. Who are some other people, and how do they get to your program?
Well, the majority of the folks that I work with are living in the local shelters in Boston, and they come in the morning. We open at 9, and they come in at 9, and we close at 4, and they go back to the shelters such as Long Island, Anchor Inn, Pine Street. Our mission is to try to help homeless folks connect with services that they need to move out of homelessness into permanent housing. And a lot of people have fallen through the cracks of our economic success story, and it seems to be the people at the bottom end that have not shared in the economic success that Massachusetts has had in these last decade or so.
But you had said earlier before we started that it's also a kind of fairly wide variety of people end up homeless. It's not just poorer people.
Right, and I think that is a very real point, that sometimes people stereotype homelessness people as, you know, people who are alcoholics or drug addicts or whatever. Oftentimes people have either a bad business deal sometimes, and they could be millionaires one day and down in their luck the next day. And sometimes people have jobs that, because of a health condition, that overnight, I could think of a story of a man who came into me recently who had a heart condition that he didn't know about, and part of his job was he got room and board and took care of a building. When he no longer could take care of the building, he lost his housing overnight and ended up at Pine Street Inn, and then ended up working with us to try to get out, take the next steps to get out of homelessness. So I think people sometimes think it's just people who, you know, don't try, but in fact, a lot of people have a divorce. We have a lot of people who maybe live with family members, you know, maybe they are mildly retarded, and their parents age, they pass away, the house is sold, and they don't have those social supports that their parents provided for them, and they can't make it. And so they often end up in shelters. We have a great number of people who, you know, have been deinstitutionalized by the mental health system and then institutionalized in the shelter system. And we don't, the real issue, I think one of the real issues with curing homelessness is housing. We have a real lack of affordable housing. The prices of housing with our economy have gone up. People making minimum wage cannot afford a one-bedroom apartment in the city of Boston. The waits, you know, people will say to you, we have a real big stock of affordable housing. And that, in fact, might be true, but just recently, we went through the MHFA book only to find that the majority of those places, their waiting lists even, are closed. So clients can't even get their applications in. So it's hard to really maintain hope for people when it takes so long to get through the process. The other group of people that we're really seeing a rise in is the elderly. You know, it's more difficult to, on a Social Security check, to pay market rate apartments. The shortage, some of the, I know we've seen it in a lot of the cities where they feel safe and they're close to support systems, a lot of their homes have been sold as condos. A lot of three-deckers. We have a real movement of people buying a condo. The three-deckers are being converted, and people are able to make a lot of money, but they're also causing elderly folks, as the rents increase, to not be able to eat, and not be able to afford medical costs. And as that becomes more and more stressful, you see the results in their health, and then they often end up on the street and in our shelters. And that is really a very sad scenario because they're also very easily robbed and, victims because they're not that strong. And one of the things, there's been a lot of urgency really to really look at the issue of what kind of supports elderly folks need before they're put on the street. Some experience some dementia, which causes some behaviors that I think need to be worked with instead of just leading towards eviction. Because once they're evicted, they really get even more disorientated, and it's really hard to get them. Many will sleep outside because they fear sleeping in a shelter. And then you have all other kinds of health problems, like frostbite, that is a real problem in the winter. And it takes an incredible amount of energy for an elderly person to walk through the system that we have to even get subsidized housing. They have to put together 5 years of housing history. They have to know where they lived and their address of the landlord. They need to.
So nobody will take your word for it? Or?
No, you have to be able to prove their housing history because the housing authority will check their references. They do credit checks, query checks, and the wait to get into a BHA development very few people make it before a year. And the other aspect of it is the population that we service, 45 and up, many of whom are disabled. Because of some of the recent expiring use issues where the government gave money to developers to build so that low-income people could live in these buildings with the agreement that after 25 years, they could pay off their mortgage and rent the apartment at any rate that they wanted.
Come out from that obligation.
Come out from that obligation. And as they have, many of them have done it in a more humane way. They wait till the person who is elderly dies, and they rent up at market rate. So we are losing more and more housing for the low-income folks, for the real low-income folks. And it's forced because of the economy, the sort of people that were just above that, to take really the resources from the real poor. And so we are, we're getting more and more people who are in need of housing. Our shortage of housing really has caused health problems, mental health problems, economic problems, because what people don't realize is as people are not paying rent to a department, we are paying double with some of these other services. They're paying for the shelter beds, your tax dollars really being doubly taxed.
Are there enough beds?
No, many people are turned away. One of the saddest things is many of our young families are being denied emergency shelter.
Because?
Because there aren't enough family shelter beds. They're being put up in hotels and motels. We've really seen, instead of homelessness decreasing in this good economic reality, we have seen it increase, which I think it really should, anyway, touch the conscience of the rest of us as Americans, in this land of wealth and opportunity. Why do we have so many people having no food resources, no housing resources? Housing has become a marketable commodity rather than a human right, which really...
Including public housing.
Including public housing. I think one of the things that I experienced this myself when I worked in a housing development in Columbia Point Housing Project, when it was Columbia Point, and Harbor Point bought it. And I think we were pointing out at that time, and I think it's something to pay attention to, that it is a good model to have mixed income housing, where you have different economic groups in there. But whenever they try to put this model into practice, you never see it that they take away from the rich to share with the poor. You always see they take away housing from the poorest to the poor and then give it to moderate and market rate units, which, again, the people who have nothing, who, you know, seem to
End up
get
with
less,
less, yeah.
end up with less. And, you know, eventually people rise up, you know, in other ways in their anger, and we will feel the effects of that, I think. And people become hopeless. You know, people eventually sometimes get stuck. And you see that if you can get people when they first become homeless and get them back to work.
Let's leave that for after the break.
Okay.
We had a couple minutes left. Because I think you're saying that once you become homeless, you're going to stay homeless for a while for a whole host of reasons, and we can review, you know, some of those reasons. But again, you made a quick reference, and perhaps you could address it briefly. It's kind of like the impression that these are lazy alcoholics. You know, that there's a sort of a negative attitude among society toward homeless, as though they were the caricature I just... A comment about that, Jean.
Well, I think that that is true, and that's the only way I think we're going to change that, is if people come to know homeless people. Because homeless people have the same interests and enjoy the same things as you and I do. Many of them are college educated, are very bright, are, you know, they're not the stereotypical...
They're not lazy.
They're not lazy. Some things have happened to them, and I think when they became homeless, the idea of the shame of living, they don't connect with some of their regular support systems because they're embarrassed about being homeless. They don't want their friends who are housed. You could be working next to a person who's homeless or at a risk of homelessness. They're going to be too embarrassed to talk to you about the fact that they can't pay next month's rent. So I think that lots of times they get cut off from family and support. Many say, I don't want my family to know where I am. And it's not because they just got hard in their luck. Some, it's a course of divorce. You know, it's a case of divorce where, you know, they've split up and they just don't have the economic resources to rent an apartment on their own.
Okay. Well, let's pick up with that at the end of the break and look at the stuck part of it. Thank you.
AT&T Broadband of Norwood and Westwood will hold a 6-week workshop in video production to train local volunteers. The workshop will teach volunteers how to use camcorders and studio cameras and also train them in lighting for the sets, creating graphics, post-production editing, and audio engineering. AT&T Broadband currently uses trained volunteers on many programs such as town meetings, high school sports coverage, the 4th of July parade, and high school graduation. Workshops are held at the AT&T Broadband Studio located on 375 Vanderbilt Avenue in Norwood. The workshops are free of charge. Volunteering your time will help bring local events and programs of interest to your community. To register for the workshop, contact Kerry Darris or Jerry Comic at the AT&T Broadband Studio at 781-769-7668. That number again is 781-769-7668.
To be a mother, you must know these things. How to hold your baby, feed and care for your baby, but most important, how to be there for your baby. If you die while giving birth, you can't be there. And if you die, chances are your baby will too. So if you or someone you love is pregnant, see a healthcare worker and be prepared to take action if you see any of these signs: bleeding, severe headache or fever, if your waters break even a little, if your birth pains last more than a day, get to a healthcare worker immediately. Because before you can hold and comfort and love, before you can care for your baby, you must first care for yourself. The Safe Motherhood Initiative, because our mothers are our future.
you did make a reference to sort of shame and hopelessness. So maybe we should talk a little bit about how people get stuck in shelters. And your last comment had to do with guilt and shame. Maybe we could start with that.
Okay. Well, a lot of folks, you know, again, blame themselves for their homelessness. Some, you know, they just made some choices and then they feel bad about it and they kind of beat themselves up. And it's hard for them to ask for help. It's hard for them to say, what can I do now? And there are resources out there. And one of the reasons why, you know, the center sort of works is that sometimes they don't even know what they need. They know that they're here, but in the recovery process, and they need time to recover, you can look at a person and say, of course they can do this, 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 and you see so much potential there. And you connect them. You know, we have resources for employment, resources for different things that you can connect people with. But sometimes they can't move there yet. And that is where the center sort of tries to provide some nurturance and some activities, of social activities sometimes, to go to the Fine Arts Museum or to, you know, go for a walk with the walking club and, you know, different kinds of things so that people can start relating again to one another. They can form a support group for each other. And then often the best connection of asking for help is somebody sitting beside somebody in the dining room, sharing a meal and saying, why don't you talk to so-and-so? Why don't you talk to Jean? Why don't you talk to Brian? Why don't you talk to Joe? And when they do then, of course, we can tell them the different options that are on the menu. Because I think one of the important things, people, when they're homeless, lose a lot of their sense of choices. You know, they are told when to go to bed. They have to pick up a ticket for their bed every night at a certain time. You know, they have to get up in the morning at a certain time. They have to shower at a certain time. So, you know, it kind of, they lose their identity in some ways and become sort of a number. And what we try to do is try to provide a variety of experiences for people that they can make some choices around. And the hardest thing, I think, for us sometimes is to patiently wait until they're ready. And really, they're making the choice and we're not.
Okay, let me interrupt, though, because let's just go back. I've just become homeless. Where do I go? What do I do? And where in that process do I find out about you? You're already talking about, and I think it's very important that we return to what you do with people who are coming to your center. But I'm new now to the homeless world. Where do I go today? What do people do?
Well, people usually, I would have to say, they probably find out from another homeless person where to go. It's incredible, the networking there. But if they don't know, they might call the Mass Coalition for Homeless. They might call, if their family's on welfare, they might go to the welfare office. But they might call the city hotline, emergency city hotline.
So let's say I call that. What do I get? What do I...
They would tell you where the available shelters are.
Okay.
So they would tell you can go to Long Island, for instance, and go out to a Long Island shelter. You can go to Pine Street Inn. I'm talking about single individuals.
So I have to go to Pine Street?
Yes.
Or I have to go to Long Island? Or I know you get a bus to Long Island.
You get the bus from there, and there's
Pine
also
Street.
Woods Mullen that's right on Mass Ave. There's a Long Island Annex in St. Francis House, which is kind of hard to get into because it's a smaller unit. The hard thing is that lots of times, for instance, Pine Street has many, many good programs, but in order to get to those programs, you have to spend a certain amount of time in Pine Street, which is a wet shelter. And that's meaning that you can be actively drinking and still stay there.
You just have to behave yourself.
You just have
Basically.
to be, you have to be not violent.
Right.
So as a result, some people, you know, really are afraid going there, you know, because they don't know when something could erupt, because that's always possible when people are under the influence that their behavior is not going to be appropriate. So that's the entry point to a lot of their other programs.
Now, if I go to a local emergency room, will they know how to direct me?
That's a good question. I think some people do. Like if you went to Boston Medical Center, I would think because they have a whole unit for the homeless, healthcare for the homeless as a whole unit there, and I think they're very familiar. And I think Mass General also has a unit for homeless folks. So I guess it depends on how knowledgeable the people in the emergency room are. But there's a book called Down and Out that is put out by the Mass Coalition for the Homeless that kind of gives you a whole overview of all different kinds of services that are available for people: employment, food, shelter. But there are gateways, and there are also barriers in those gateways in terms of, if you don't get there at a certain time, you may not get a bed that night because there is only a limited amount of resources. So many people are, in fact, sleeping on the floor of the lobby. We have many people that will not go into the shelter system. And I think that's why when people ask, how many people are homeless? It's almost virtually impossible to count the number of homeless people because homelessness is a temporary thing. People could be homeless and living with you. People could be homeless and living with their aunt or their cousin.
Sure.
And so I think, who are we counting? How many people sleep in the Blue Hills? How many people sleep under the bridge? How many people sleep on the grates? There are a lot of people who are petrified or have medical conditions. Because once you go into the shelter, you can't leave. Some people have medical conditions where they have to be able to get outdoors. They're claustrophobic and they can't stay in tight quarters. And it also has a big impact on people's health. They're sleeping beside people they don't know. They're in very tight quarters. They're afraid. The stress, as we know, also leads to greater amounts of illness and diseases and what have you. And so they're not getting good night's sleep. They're sleeping, but they're not. Or somebody is snoring beside them, to a point where they can't sleep. So they're often complaining about being fatigued, being tired, sleeping at the center during the day because it's quiet.
Now, how do they find out about the center?
I think word of mouth. The shelters, we have a flyer, and the shelters do know. But to be honest with you, it's mostly through other friends. Other friends who came to the center. A counselor who happens to know about the services and gets connected with somebody might refer somebody over. Sometimes I think we should do more PR than we do. We have about anywhere from 110 to 150 people for lunch every day. And
who pays for that?
The elderly are paid for from, I believe, the elderly, support systems, and the state pays for the elderly, and the DTA funds the younger
So I
folks.
won't have to. If
No.
I'm homeless, I could. And in your case, I know it's for older people. So if I'm over 45, which we both know I'm not, I don't have to worry about paying for a meal if I go there. And I can just go there?
All our services are free. The only requirement is that when you come there that you're sober that day. So if people come there under the influence, we ask them to leave for that day and come back tomorrow when they're sober.
But Pine Street, I just have to be in good control. I don't have to be sober.
Right. But they have to be out during the day. They have to leave in the morning and then come back later on in the afternoon.
Although, don't they make exceptions during very inclement weather?
Yes, when it's very cold, they can stay in.
Stay in.
But a lot of people want to get out. They don't want. They find they want to get away. And the other thing about what they love to do, we have very avid readers. I cannot keep people. We was talking about that today because we often ask our friends to give us their old paperbacks. Because you can't keep them in books. That I think they just read, you know, in a variety of things. You have a lot of people interested in learning and reading and improving their skills, so that it really, and we have really an interesting combination of people, and for the most part, they are very peaceable and they get along very well, you know.
So on every level, though, so we have a number of people who can't, because of shame, guilt, disability, whatever, aren't able to enter into the shelter system. Then there must be a certain number of people who don't have enough self-esteem to ask for the kind of help that your program provides.
Right.
Nonetheless, you get about 110 people there every day for...
Yeah, 110 to 150, depending on the time of the month. Many of them are on disability, so when they would have their check at the beginning of the month, you know, they might buy their food out, you know, and not come and do some fun things, you know. And I know sometimes, you know, people make comment that they will look at the menu, and then if they don't like our menu, they go to St. Francis House. And I always think that's, you know, some people look at that like, well, don't they, you know, shouldn't they just enjoy what you
grateful.
have? And I
Yeah.
just say, well, actually, if you went to a restaurant, wouldn't you look at a menu, and if you didn't like what that restaurant have, you went to the other. They don't have that option. So they make a choice within the framework of which they're living, you know, and what's wrong with that? To me, it's a sign of hope that they're still making choices. And that's the important thing. They have to continue to make choices. When they sit back, I think, and just get lulled into institutionalized shelter life, I think that is when we have more danger. Once that happens, it's really hard to get people to believe that they can make it. The assault on self-esteem when people are homeless is acute. I think when families have children, it's a little bit more motivating. They want to get out for the sake of their kids. But with individuals, when they become homeless and have that kind of self-esteem blow, it's hard.
They lose their energy.
Yeah, they lose their energy to think that they can get beyond that.
All right. Well, let's take a break and maybe pick up with that in terms of how we get people then to borrow your energy and move on. So we'll take a break. Thank you.
Sweetheart, smoke outside now. You promised.
Okay, hon.
Sweetheart, smoke outside now. You promised.
What kind of man are you?
I'm a father.
Look here, my father was a father, and he smoked his brains out in the house.
Watch as he blows those smoke rings on my little red face.
You probably have asthma.
Asthma? Schmasma. I'm telling you, nothing's gonna happen to your kids.
Don't swear when you're lying. You know very well that thousands of kids get bronchitis, ear infections, and even pneumonia from their parents' cigarette smoke. And didn't you promise your little angels you'd smoke outside?
Hey, Daddy.
Those little devils are just so sweet.
Do the right thing.
Please, smoke outside.
Until you can stop, go out for your kids.
Take the pledge. Call 1-800-513-1157.
Have you saved a life today?
I took 2 flood victims to a shelter.
I donated a day's pay to help a family that lost everything in a fire.
Have you saved a life today?
I teach a class in infant CPR.
I donated a pint of blood.
Have you saved a life today?
No, but today somebody saved mine.
The American Red Cross. Together, we can save a life.
This is me. And my mom and dad. And my big brother, Alex. And Jack. This is the day I learned that sandals got their name from sand. And that the ocean is bigger than all of us. This is the day we all got to forget I was sick. This was my wish.
Well, I think it would be helpful, Jean, if we could talk about how you work with people at your center, for example, kind of what works, what doesn't work, barriers. You've already talked about the housing stock, and maybe in the last segment we can talk a little bit about Section 8 and some of the mechanical problems that are barriers. But what are some of the kind of psychological issues that you bump into that you have to kind of work with in order to get people to make use of your services and move out of homelessness?
I think the biggest thing for me is to instill some hope. And sometimes that is engaging people in the dining room and building relationship, not even talking about housing, talking about books that we're reading, talking about something that's in the newspaper that day. I think they have to develop a trust in me that I care about them as a person sometimes before they'll come to the next step. The people who come to the office and sign up and know what they want, they're really easy. You know, they don't have a job, I can refer them to employment, I can give them the tools, I can help them with whatever they need to connect. They have that much self-esteem to come and sign up.
So about a third of the people sort of know how to move in, make good use of your services, and basically move out. Okay.
And then there are other people for whom they got stuck and they're still stuck. And they're the most difficult to instill hope back in, that they can do something different, especially when the system is going to put up obstacles in their way. You know, the market housing, I can't underscore enough, I think part of the major cure to homelessness is having a bigger amount of affordable housing. We do not have a supply to meet the demand.
Okay, and we'll get to that, and I think that's very, very important, but we both know the client we share, we'll call him Ed. If you told him today, here's a key to your own apartment, we both know he wouldn't use it.
No.
Why?
Well, he has been institutionalized.
In the homeless system.
In the homeless system, and before that in the mental health system. He was one of those folks that was let out of Bridgewater in '79 and has been wandering in the homeless system ever since. When I met that particular person, he was very psychotic and was not on any kind of medication. And it took, when you said, how do you work with somebody, he used to sit in the corner of a dining room, and I used to just go over to him and say hello. And sometimes he would talk to me about different things, and other times he wouldn't have anything to say. Eventually, as he got to trust me more, I talked to him about how life could be a little bit better if he was on medication. And then it was another 6 or 7 weeks before he consented to going with me to Kit Clark to meet with you. And even then, he said he had treatment, all kinds of different treatment, and he didn't want counseling. He just wanted to see you. And that worked because obviously, on the medication, he became less psychotic. And even though it still is a major thing for him to make incremental changes, he has. He successfully, after 18 years, reunited before his father's death and made the trip home. And he also did that, you know, with his mother's death. So he's had a lot of losses. He had glaucoma, and he wasn't going into, he hadn't had a physical for over 10 years, and then did make that move. So when he gets really stuck about next moves, I remind him about all the moves that he has made. But I think he is more able at this point to come to the office to talk, to come and ask for help. And as he's been more able to do that, even though he can sometimes take the next step to go to the provider that will provide the help, you know, medically or whatever, he can talk about it. And sometimes it takes a lot of talking to him before he will take the next step. I think if I gave him a key and in the right environment, there weren't too many structures in a place. I think because he needs to be in DMH housing, I think. But if he had an easier setting when there wasn't too many demands, I think he could come in and go. Lots of people, when they move into housing, they get an apartment, they still stay in the shelter for a little while.
I've suggested that, it sounds so silly, but you're right. I mean, I've suggested to him that he let us, you particularly, find him an apartment and then not use it for a while, but just have it, or maybe use it once a week, leave his stuff there. And who knows, one of these days it may be. But it's quite a struggle for him to think about cashing it in. I think in the same way it was an enormous struggle for him to finally commit to basically doing something about his psychosis. That was a hard, you'd think it would be easy for, you'd think he'd want to unload it, but it was very, very hard.
It was very hard. And he's so bright and knowledgeable. And you can see that. I mean, he's bilingual, he's fluent in French, he's so gifted, and he is very bright, and yet his mental health really keeps him stuck.
So he's not lazy.
He's not lazy. No. He really is up early in the morning, walking the streets. I think the thing is I think the intimacy question for him is hard. He doesn't want people to be too close. He's got to keep people at bay. He wants to know you're there, but he needs to keep you at a distance.
Of course, it's very paradoxical. He'll complain about how crowded the shelter is and how he has no privacy, but it's much too crowded. And yet, on the other hand, it's the housing with maybe other people and the sharing and the intimacy. So in many ways, paradoxically, it'll be far less crowded than what he has to live with, but the expectation will be on stability and closeness, and he just isn't ready for that. Ready for that, that's right. Yeah.
And that has something that we in the homeless world have talked about for a long time, of like transitional steps for people without a whole lot of expectations, instead of, I mean, it even would be cost effective. If you had people don't want to pay the same amount for an SRO, which is a single room, if they can, when they can have their own kitchen and bathroom someplace. But sometimes they're more readily available right away. And it would help stabilize people because it would be incremental responsibility. I think that's what I feel that works, is you give little bits of incremental responsibility at a time. So if you said to somebody, okay, move into this place for a year, you only have to get a payee, so you know the rent's paid, and meet with the counselor. They have done this in New York. And don't have to talk to the counselor, just have to touch base with the counselor weekly. Don't have no service plan, nothing.
But payee, I mean, you're minimizing that. I mean, that's a fairly large surrender.
Right.
I mean, you're really basically saying, okay, you can help me manage my money.
Right. But once the rent is paid, you get to manage the rest of it. It's just really to make sure the rent gets paid. And they manage the rest of it. And most of them have payees already if they, if they've deemed that they need that kind of service. And it's hard to get payees. Very difficult to get a payee for someone, even if they want it. So then there'd be no really pressure. And they found that people are really successfully housed. But I think there is something therapeutic of checking in with someone, knowing somebody knows you're there, but not a whole lot of demands. I really think that as we like to make the choices about our own life, people moving in, as we create programs for somebody, we sometimes take that element of choice out, and they become somebody that we're controlling. And that doesn't feel good to any of us. And that doesn't help our self-esteem to know that you're in control of your own life. So even though there are some supports and structures built into that that you may argue are not controlled, are controlled, I mean, there is that element of choice. I'm choosing to do this because I'm getting this. And there has to be something you get from it. Which one of us is going to do that if we're not going to get something from
But
something?
you're also saying that in the course of the negotiation, they're borrowing some of your hopefulness, some
That's
of
right.
your more optimistic view of the possibilities which they're missing.
Right. And I think right away, one of the biggest things I say, I'm going to tell you what's on the menu. You tell me what you want to eat. And we'll go in that direction, because there's a lot on the menu. There's a lot of different ways you can go to approach this problem, and everybody's different. So I'm going to tell you what your options are that I know about, and you tell me if any of them sound good to you. And then we'll work on that menu. And I really tried to instill that, because even though people are homeless, they're not helpless. And so it has to be a partnership. The working has to be a partnership. Otherwise, and I've seen this happen, a worker or myself have worked really hard to get a resource for somebody, only for them to have them kind of give it up or not take it in the end. You know?
Well, I think there's borrowing of hope. I think, you know, I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but I think the fact that I could be available to add weekly, albeit briefly, but weekly, I think was very, very important. It wasn't that I simply said, sure, here's a prescription and I'll see you in 3 months, you know, tell me how you're doing, you know, kind of thing. And I think similarly, from that he borrows, and then obviously you're going to him in the corner and gradually having short and then longer conversation, you know, clearly that eventually allowed him to take something in.
Yeah, he allowed me to open a folder on him, do an intake. He wouldn't allow anything in the center before, and he did an intake. Now it's about this thick, but you know, now he signs up. You know, if something's coming up for him, he signs up, and he wants me to know, even more than I need to know sometimes, but he wants me to know what's going on. And so there is that, and I know when I tried to get him to do the application for DMH housing, there was a great resistance, and I had to rethink how to get this to happen, because the other aspect, I think, is each person's relationship with people is different. And some people we connect with and some people we don't.
We'll have to take a break, and then we can talk about that and sort of where we go with that. Thank you.
While progress should never come to a halt, there are many places it should never come to at all. So we work locally with communities, businesses, and people like you to save precious places around the world, forever. I'm Paul Newman. Help the Nature Conservancy save the last great places.
For people who have to deal with the harsh realities of life, there is hope. There is Volunteers of America. Volunteers of America has been rebuilding lives and restoring hope to people in need in communities across the country for more than 100 years. Volunteers of America is one of the nation's largest nonprofit charitable organizations, providing services for children and youth, the elderly, homeless people, families, and many others. We serve the emotional, physical, and spiritual needs of more than 1.5 million people a year. Find out how you can help. Call 1-800-899-0089 today. Volunteers of America. There are no limits to caring.
perhaps in the last segment we should talk about how people kind of move out of the system. What do you think it takes, and why does it take?
Well,
and then, of course, I'm sorry, you also wanted to, I think, look at some of the barriers and some of the problems out there, not just within.
Right, and I think that's the major thing, that sometimes we look at what's the problem in the person, and instead of what's the problem in the system, you know, because if there isn't enough of a supply and the demand is greater, who is going to get the resource? The person with more money. And we've seen that in particular, even people who have subsidies, you know, a Section 8 one-bedroom subsidy. I have several of our folks that have a Section 8 one-bedroom subsidy. First of all, in order to access that, you have to use the newspaper. Most of the ads and most of the housing is available through real estate. So people need telephone access to call places. The real estate people have so many people coming to them, they don't call back. The person doesn't have a callback number. Usually they're looking for a real estate fee, which is the price usually at least 1 month's rent. So if you're talking about $900, you're talking that you have to pay a real estate person that $900, and then the security deposit and your portion of the first month's rent. So that adds up to a sizable amount of money for somebody who has nothing. And so there are places where we try to assist people with a security deposit, but nobody really is out there to pay the real estate fees, which, you know, there are very few, even one-bedroom apartments that are under $1,000 in the city of Boston. And people want to live in the neighborhoods where they know, where they get their medical care, where they lived all their lives. And I think what we're seeing in some of the communities, especially, for instance, in the South End, where you had a numerous amount of single rooms where men used to be able to rent a single room and survive, even when they didn't have high incomes, that is no longer available. A lot of it's been bought up, a lot of it's been sold, and the stock that is there is pretty filled. And even now, it's 110, 120 sometimes, you know, a week rather.
A week, yeah.
And so by the time if you're on SSI, there's your whole check. You know, I don't know where, and they don't have facilities sometimes in some of them to cook. So, you know, you really can't live. So sometimes people will say, I can get a bed and a shelter, at least I can have my money to spend on myself and other things. So I think it is a complex issue. People have gotten Section 8s, and they have actually had their 120 days and not been able to secure an apartment with it. And
I was surprised to hear you say, I know it's true that many can't find an apartment once they get the Section 8, but I was surprised to hear you say that it's still possible to help people get a Section 8 coupon or whatever you call it.
Voucher,
Voucher.
Yeah, they have been giving them out, and you know, maybe the reason, and I had this theory just myself, it's not a proven theory, but maybe the reason they can give them out so readily, more readily than the housing, is that a lot of people end up turning them back in.
Now, is that true in the suburbs as well? Are there Section 8 programs for people?
You can use your Section 8 anywhere in the state.
But can you come from anywhere in the state? Okay.
Yes, it's transferred. Like if I go to Section 8 from Abington Housing Authority, I could, and I found an apartment in Boston. My subsidy would be transferred to the Boston office.
Okay.
And I would lease up and have the apartment inspected. See, there's a process that landlords have to be willing to embrace, even though the rent is secured. The tenant pays 30% of their income. Whether they're in a subsidized apartment building, such as we know as public housing, some of the MFHA-funded buildings where the tenant pays 30% of their income, or they have what they call a mobile Section 8, where if you had an apartment into your house and you were willing to rent it to me, then that apartment would be inspected by the government, and the rent would be paid by the government, all but 30%. So for instance, if I made $600 a month, $200 would be paid by me to you, but the rest of the rent would be paid directly to you by the housing authority that's handling
The
that.
rent that I,
Request.
or the rent that the inspector has determined is a fair market value?
No, the apartments are determined, well, they will only pay a certain amount for the Section 8. So the tenant is told to look for apartments that go up to a certain price range. It can be below that, but can't exceed that.
Okay.
And so when I would look for an apartment, say you were willing to rent me this apartment for $800 and my subsidy was for $900. Well, the government, I would pay my $200 if I made $600, and the government would pay the rest to equal up to the, yeah.
Okay. Now, if I live, let's say, in Wellesley or Lincoln, do those authorities have Section 8 vouchers?
Yeah.
They do.
I mean, once you get a Section 8, you can use it in any community.
Correct, but I was just wondering, can you apply in any community where you happen?
Yes, they have openings, and that's the thing. The Section 8, each housing authority will open their Section 8 list, and it's published when it's open. Very often, you have 2 or 3 days to apply.
Okay.
You know, and you have to get the application and fill it out and get it back by a certain date. Sometimes they do a lottery after that, and they pick people out from lottery and give them a number. If you're lucky, you get up to the top of the list. If not, you're at the bottom. You could wait 4 or 5 years. And then every year, which is the tricky part, especially for homeless people, because they're kind of moving around a lot. So somebody applies, and I tell them to apply for a lot of them, for 4 Section 8s in different communities. All right, and then they leave and go someplace else, another state perhaps, thinking life will be easier. And during the year, they use our mailing address, and their waiting list comes back. They have 10 days to say they want to stay on that waiting list. If they're not around during those 10 days, they lose the opportunity, and they have to start all over again. So that's the tricky part about people staying in touch. They don't have a secure address. They don't have telephones. They don't have any place to keep their things.
So do some use your program for that?
Well, they use our program for addresses, and they use our phone when they're calling. But again, they'd have to stay around all day waiting for the call back. So, and also, if you're a landlord, you're calling back and you're hearing, you've reached the Carter Madeira Center, you begin to say, well, who's this guy? Is he homeless? And there's a stigma to that. Am I going to rent this apartment to a homeless person?
Well, wasn't it this problem that led to the development of the Paul Sullivan Trust?
Housing?
Yeah, they finally decided that we might as well develop the housing ourselves, and they developed a wide network of housing.
Yeah, they have quite a wide network of housing. Right. A lot of SROs, which I think nowadays people are looking for a little bit more than just a room, if they're going to pay 30% of their income for it. But yeah, they have done a lot to develop housing, but it still hasn't. Still hasn't
touched it.
touched.
So in the last few minutes, where do you see this problem 10 years from now?
I wish I could say that I would see it resolved, but with the rate at which we are adding housing to the housing market, I see it getting worse. Each year, if you look at the statistics, unfortunately, we are having an increase in homelessness, not a decrease. And so I think unless we do something about the barriers, we get communities to create. We have not created a lot of multifamily housing, and even the multifamily housing that we have created was in the stock, is being sold as condos. So we're taking a lot of housing that was open to be rented, and it's getting into the hands of private ownership, which again, we have less and less available for people to access.
Growing need, shrinking stock. How about access to mental health care? What's your experience been with that? Is that getting better or worse?
I would say it's getting worse.
So would I.
Yeah, I would say it's getting worse. Again, there are people getting through the cracks. The harder to treat people You know, if they show up, then they're getting treated, you know, but if you can't get them to show up, they're very vulnerable, and making sometimes what you and I would consider poor choices. I think there's a real, you want people to have choices, but sometimes you can see people really hurting themselves, and some people need to be on medication. They need to have that structure and support to support them in that process. And
of course, the irony there too about mental health services is that a lot of these people end up with some kind of reasonably good health insurance, but as a provider, I'm really constrained in what kind of service I can provide. For example, I can't necessarily go out and do a lot of case finding because I can't bill for that. So my clinic, for example, couldn't meet a bottom line if we ended up doing a lot of what, say, this population requires, because it isn't defined as a third-party reimbursable service. You know,
well, it's interesting. One of the things that happens at our place is we have a student that does a internship there. And I'm wondering if we can't be a little bit creative, because I could do a lot of case finding for the clinic. And if there was a stronger partnership, we had some nurses, and one of them worked at the emergency room at New England Medical Center. And it really does help if a person has a direct link to an agency or a clinic.
Sure.
And I know that was very helpful in the case that we talked about. I knew you, I could tell you about the person, and then you're sure the connection was made. There have been times when we referred people for treatment, and because the person they met didn't understand their reality, it was hard for them to feel that person could understand them. You know, but I do think sometimes with teams of people working together, maybe you can't get paid for the case finding, but in some ways we have people that are finding cases. And just if we had those kind of stronger linkages, maybe that would be a way to look at that issue.
And in 10 words or less, do you think the government is kind of pulling away from responsibility in this problem area?
I think so. I think we really, we owe it to the most vulnerable in our society to put them first, and we put them last. And I think it says something. We make them invisible. We put them on a bus and ship them off to the island every night. How many people? We have a Bayview Inn for the mentally ill. We have Anchor Inn for the homeless. We have Long Island Shelter. We have a no in my backyard philosophy in our society, and we all have to take some responsibility for that.
Well, on that note, sobering note, we'll have to stop. On behalf of the Norfolk Alliance for the Mentally Ill, I really want to thank you for being here today. Appreciate it, Jean.